an original MCM production.
Now we have Fred Royal, the president of the Milwaukee branch of the NAACP, to introduce our program. Fred?
Good afternoon. Speaking of construction, as Milwaukee experiences an unprecedented surge in downtown development, it has an opportunity to translate that investment into substantial and meaningful jobs for low-income residents. New research from the Public Policy Forum seeks to shed light on whether the city has the right policies and programs in place to do so. Forum President Rob Henken and senior researcher Joe Peterangelo will present the research which examines the performance of the city's Residence Preference Program and explores best practices from other targeted hiring programs across the country and their potential applicability in Milwaukee. Senior researcher Joe Peterangelo with the Public Policy Forum. Peterangelo's research focuses on economic development, workforce development, and transportation. Before joining the forum in 2011, Peterangelo worked as a planning assistant for the City of Milwaukee's Department of Cities Development and as a research assistant with the Metro Chicago Information Center. Prior to moving to Milwaukee in 2008, he was a program coordinator for the United Way of Dane County in Madison, Wisconsin. Peterangelo holds a Master's of Urban Planning degree from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a bachelor's degree in Sustainable Development from the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. He is a member of the American Planning Association. Rob Henken is the president of the Public Policy Forum. Since joining the forum in January 2008, Henken has authored and co-authored 4 reports that won national awards from governmental research associations. He was named one of Milwaukee's 100 most influential leaders in the Milwaukee Business Journal annual Power Book in 2012, and one of Milwaukee's Game Changers by M Magazine in 2013. Prior to becoming the Public Policy Forum president, Henken worked in Milwaukee County government for nearly 10 years, serving as Director of Research for the County Board, Director of Health and Human Services, and Director of Administrative Services. Henken also has directed 2 nonprofit organizations in Milwaukee, the Alliance for Future Transit and the Milwaukee Jobs Initiative. Prior to moving to Milwaukee in 1994, he worked for 7 years on Capitol Hill as a senior aide to 2 congressmen and as staff director for the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. In addition to leading the forum, Henken is an adjunct associate professor at the University of Milwaukee's School of Architecture and Urban Planning, where he teaches on transportation policy. He also is president of the Governmental Research Association, which includes nearly 30 research organizations from 19 states. Please welcome Joe Peterangelo and Rob Henken to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Fred, and thanks to all of you for being here and for giving us this opportunity to talk about what we think is a very important and timely piece of research. I also want to add that this project would not have taken place without the leadership of Fred Royal. We actually partnered with Fred to submit a grant request to the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, which funded this research. And it's been an honor and a pleasure to work with you on this, Fred, and now we hope to effectuate the results. So, As you have already surmised, we are tag teaming on this presentation. I'm sort of going to set the stage for all of you. Then Joe is going to do the heavy lifting and tell you about the research findings and shed some light on some best practices from some other parts of the country. Just to start, I want to sort of sum up why this is a research project that I think in many ways is more important than many, just because of its timeliness. You may be familiar with this map if you're a subscriber to the Milwaukee Business Journal. The Business Journal is tracking the surge in downtown and four-county development activity that is taking place. This is a real piece of good news for our region. All of the development activity, the different colors, by the way, are just different types of developments. These are projects that are $2 million or more. You can see the concentration particularly in downtown Milwaukee and in the city of Milwaukee. So here we have this opportunity. We have a very exciting and important surge in economic development. The bad news is that we also continue to have some issues with regard to unemployment, particularly in Milwaukee's central city. Now, what this graph is showing you is the unemployment and labor force participation rates broken down by race. The reason that this is 2014 data is not because we're deliberately cherry picking. We know that unemployment picture has gotten much better in 2015 and 2016. Unfortunately, the Labor Department data that actually divides by race, the latest year for which that data are available is 2014. So again, things have improved a bit from what you're seeing here, but it's unmistakable in terms of the unemployment issue, particularly for African Americans in the city of Milwaukee. And when you drill it down even further, African American male unemployment, clearly a big challenge for our community. So you put those two pieces together. We have a surge in downtown development. We have contractors that are looking for workers. We have an aging construction workforce in our community, even without this surge in development. And we have lots of people unemployed in Milwaukee's central city. So, of course, one of the strategies that ought to be in place is to have some programs that are aimed at targeted hiring. To what extent can we use, particularly the public dollars that we are investing in these economic development projects, to also secure employment for Milwaukee residents who are most badly in need of employment? So in light of this almost unprecedented opportunity, the Public Policy Forum set out to see how well the programs that we currently have in place to try to connect Central City residents to these types of jobs, how well are they working? We wanted to analyze recent program outcomes. We wanted to understand what are the public policy objectives of the so-called RPP. RPP stands for the Residential Preference Program. I'm going to give you a little bit more background on that in just a second. We thought it was very important, again, because of this opportunity, to not only take a look at how our existing targeted hiring programs were working, but also to take a look around the country and to see, are there best practices being utilized in other cities that perhaps we can borrow from? We did not enter this project assuming that the programs that we have in place are not working well, but we did enter this project assuming that there was something that we could learn from others. And so in light of all that, our other primary goal in terms of taking on this project was to identify possible changes to our existing RPP that policymakers here should be considering. So a little bit more background on the Residence Preference Program. The program actually started in 1991. This is a City of Milwaukee program. Initially, it was targeted at specific areas of the city. They were the areas that were encompassed by the Community Development Block Grant Program. So some of the poorest zip codes and neighborhoods in Milwaukee's central city were specifically targeted for hiring. And there was a policy goal of roughly 15% at the beginning of the program, increased, I'm looking to Joe because I forget the number, I think to 25% by the late 90s. So that program was in place in that form up until 2009. In 2009, there were some very important expansions to the RPP. There was a related ordinance called the Moore Ordinance enacted. So whereas the original RPP applied to public works projects that involved City of Milwaukee funding and resources, the Moore Ordinance expanded the program to also encompass private development projects that involved $1 million of city financial assistance or above. So that could either mean direct cash assistance, it could mean assistance through tax incremental financing, it could mean assistance through below market land sales. But the premise was that if we are going to put public dollars into private development projects, then we should also apply our hiring goals to those projects. At the same time in 2009, the program also changed in that it was expanded to include the citywide population. So no longer were specific neighborhoods in the city of Milwaukee targeted. Instead, the goal was simply to hire city residents, and in doing so, policymakers also upped the threshold. So instead of 25%, the goal then became 40% of the hours worked on these projects were to be filled by city residents. In terms of the eligibility requirements, not only do you have to be a City of Milwaukee resident, you have to either have been unemployed for 30 days or employed for fewer than 1,000 hours during the previous 12 months. And another new requirement that was added in 2009 was that if your income, even if you are employed, if your income falls below the level that would qualify your family for the federal school lunch program, then you are also eligible for the RPP. Again, just to refresh your memory one more time, because we're going to get into this in detail, we are talking about public works projects and private developments receiving $1 million or more of city resources and 40% of the total worker hours on these projects. So that's the program. Again, in existence since 1991, changed substantially in 2009. So now the question is, how's it working? Well, what this graph is showing you is the number of individuals who are on the list of RPP certified individuals that the City of Milwaukee holds. You can see about 4,200 people signed up between 1991 and 2010. That number has now just about doubled since 2011. Obviously, the economic downturn had something to do with that, but also efforts to really expand the program appear to have resulted in more people actually being signed up and being certified. So that's good news. Some interesting news is when you break down the individuals who have become RPP certified by zip code, as you can see on this map, you see that really there's representation in the program from throughout the city of Milwaukee. So many people believe that the RPP is a targeted program in that it is specifically targeted toward certain disadvantaged populations, in particular African American males in the central city. And clearly, because of the requirements, that is a group that finds a high level of eligibility. But I think one of the surprising things that our analysis found, and I'm not telling you whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, is that the people who are becoming RPP certified are really representative on a socioeconomic and racial basis pertaining to the city as a whole. So you'll essentially see sort of an even split between Latino, African American, and white in terms of eligibility list for the program. In terms of the hours worked on public works project, here's some other good news. So again, I told you that the threshold was 40%. From 2010 to 2015, in terms of the hours worked on eligible public works projects, 48% of the worker hours were by RPP certified individuals. So in terms of meeting that basic goal of wanting to employ city residents on public works projects, the goal is being achieved so far. The downside, and as you can tell I have a theme going here, good news, bad news, the downside is while people are being hired for the RPP, more questionable is whether the people who are being hired and gaining invaluable work experience are actually being given the opportunity to embark on long-term careers in the construction industry. And one of the ways that we can try to get at that question is to look at the number of individuals hired on these projects who are apprentices. Because for those of you who know the construction industry and how the trades work, you really need to be on an apprentice track to have the best shot of embarking yourself on that long-term career. And here we see that only 5% of the participants were indeed apprentices. So that's something to watch, and we're going to be speaking about that in depth in just a second. just want to close my part by then shedding some light on what we've seen in terms of this important expansion, to go beyond just the city public works projects, but to try to hit these private economic development projects, which, as the map at the beginning showed you, are taking off here in the city of Milwaukee. We see that so far only 5 projects between 2009 and today have qualified under the ordinance that was established. There's lots of reasons for that. Some projects did not receive $1 million or more of city assistance. In that case, there are often development agreements formed anyway between the city and the private developer, to the extent that there needs to be one. But for the most part, what we've seen are 5 projects so far. One of the real important projects that Jerry mentioned in his remarks, that you can see right outside the window, if you can get a glimpse behind me, of course, is the Northwestern Mutual project. Northwestern Mutual has been held up as an example, and justifiably in our minds, of the promise of targeted hiring. So far, 44% of the hours worked on the Northwestern Mutual Tower have been completed by RPP workers. 10% are apprentices, so higher than the 5%, still perhaps not quite as high as we'd like to see. And one of the things that Northwestern Mutual has done is they have been able to hire 50 entry-level RPP workers to do some of the construction assembly work off-site. So that was a very important development that they were able to creatively come up with to make sure that they were hiring city residents. But once again, these off-site jobs are not necessarily, maybe, but not necessarily entrees into long-term careers in construction. When we look at the racial breakdown of the workers on 10 recent development projects, so this would be the projects that actually qualified under the ordinance, plus additional projects for which development agreements existed, again, we see that the spread in terms of the racial breakdown is essentially similar to the general population breakdown within the city of Milwaukee. Finally, when we look at all of the development projects, again, apprentices a very small portion of the workforce. So that's an introduction. I'm now going to turn things over to Joe to tell you about some of the issues and concerns we raised, share some examples from some other parts of the country, conclude with some policy recommendations and options, and then we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. So in our analysis, we see a lot of successes with the RPP, also a lot of issues that came up, different opinions from different stakeholders. So some of those key issues were just beginning with the targeted population. Currently, the program focuses on city residents who meet those unemployment, underemployment qualifications. Some people feel that the program should really be open to all city residents, and on the other hand, people feel that the program should really be doing more to target those who most need the work, long-term unemployed, and also underrepresented populations, minorities, for example. In terms of projects covered, we noted that the program on the private development side hasn't really covered very many projects so far, so we point out that there could be ways of expanding the program to really apply to more projects, whether that's by reducing that $1 million city contribution threshold or expanding it to other departments perhaps. The 40% participation requirement, we heard that in some ways, that's a pretty ambitious goal, and that's a positive thing. On the other hand, some people feel that having a static goal, despite changes in the labor market, despite the development activity ebbing and flowing, may not be the right way to go. There may be more analysis done, and that percentage kind of changing depending on conditions. In terms of apprenticeships, people feeling that more should be done with apprenticeships, and as we looked across the country, we saw other cities that do more to encourage apprenticeships, and particularly getting targeted populations into apprenticeships. And then finally, the integration with job training and placement. We see here, when you get certified for the RPP program, you can simply go fill out the form, show that you're a city resident, and you meet one of those qualifications. In other places, there's more of a process of really assessing your experience, getting you connected in with the workforce training system if you are an entry-level worker that really needs training in order to get into the pipeline. So I'm just going to give you a few examples then as we looked across the country in terms of targeted goals. When we looked at here, we only have that one goal that we have, the one requirement of 40% participation. When we looked at Minneapolis, for example, they have separate goals that are in place for minority participation and female participation. That was based on just there being underrepresented in the construction industry. So they really tied these goals to addressing those disparities that they'd shown. So that would be one way we could do it here potentially. And these are goals that have not been met on every single project. In fact, they were having trouble meeting the goals, but then currently the Viking Stadium project happening right now, which is a huge development in downtown Minneapolis, they've had a lot of success. They've had 37% minority participation, which met the goal, and they met the female participation goal as well. So that's kind of set a new signal in Minneapolis in terms of these being achievable, and so we think that that's an example that we could look to. In terms of integration with the workforce system, as I mentioned, we don't really necessarily, when a person gets certified, we don't necessarily have them connecting in with the training that they may need. So if you're an RPP certified worker, you're still competing with other RPP certified workers that may be more experienced. You may not be plugged into getting up to the training you need to get an apprenticeship, for example. What we see in some other places, like Washington, D.C., they have what they call a first source employment program, where they have a one-stop agency that contractors go to when they have new job openings on these development projects. There's a certain period of time where that's the first place they'll go, and the workforce agency is really charged with having a list of ready workers who are not only certified for their program, but are trained and ready. So it helps both the workers who are prepared find employment. It also helps the contractors find qualified workers to meet the requirement of the program. In terms of apprenticeships, again, we have pretty low apprenticeship numbers here in Milwaukee, at least in recent years, and not a lot of requirements in terms of what the city requires on a public works project, for example, in terms of apprentices. And in other places, like Oakland, they have a 15% requirement on all projects that 15% of the workers will be apprentices, or 15% of the hours worked will be completed by apprentices. Madison, for example, has a requirement that if you're bidding on a city project, you have to be sponsoring an apprenticeship, an apprentice. So those are options of things that we could do to encourage more apprentices, perhaps. And then one thing that really stood out to us was we have a lot of different stakeholders that are involved in this whole process. From the city has its requirements. There's the contractors. There's the labor unions. There's community organizations really that are advocating for their populations. There's a lot of different groups that are at the table here, but there's not a lot of communication. There's a lot of confusion between them on how the program works and what the goals are. And what we saw in other places like San Francisco, they've established these public-private committees that are stakeholder committees that help to guide the program's development. So one example, in San Francisco, they currently had a 25% resident participation requirement. They wanted to get it up to 50%. That was the goal. They had a 7-year plan to get to that goal. They had this committee that was formed, but they were actually looking at data. They were tracking, how is the program working? They were looking at labor force data. So it was more, they had more of an ear to the ground, and so they saw that getting up to that 50% was going to require. They had to slow the process down because they weren't getting there, and they also knew that they needed to do a lot more training to get the workforce even to meet the 30% where they were at, when they made this kind of pause in the program. They said, we're not even meeting the 30% with the training we have in place. We need to ramp up training just to even meet that. So just having that committee in place and looking at the data, they were able to kind of make the process more in tune with what's going on in the market. One other thing we looked at was other programs like the RPP here in Milwaukee. So there are other targeted hiring programs that other local governments have. These are examples of those. And we found that there are possibly lessons learned or things that you could learn from some of these other programs. And also opportunities for collaboration or synergy between them. With one example of something unique happening in one of these other programs is the Uplift Milwaukee program. This is a new program the county has created. It's really focused not on the construction, but on the end user jobs. So the Bucks have signed on to this program, and what that means is they're using Employ Milwaukee, formerly the Milwaukee Area Workforce Investment Board, as their first source when they have new jobs opening in the development after construction on the Bucks Arena and the surrounding development. So that's a way that they're expanding beyond just the construction jobs to other industries, and that could be, if that's successful, that could be something that the RPP could possibly consider as well. Some of our recommendations, this is kind of a review, but we thought we could look at having more than one goal for the program, so not just hiring city residents, but possibly having another goal based on disadvantaged workers or minority, underrepresented populations. Expanding the RPP to cover more projects. Again, that could be reducing the $1 million threshold. It could be RACM, the Redevelopment Authority. We could apply the RPP possibly to more of their projects or to other city departments. We've already kind of gone over the apprenticeship thing. There could be a lot more done on encouraging apprenticeships and aligning the RPP more closely with the workforce development system. Possibly creating this public-private stakeholder committee to help guide the program. And then looking at ways of collaborating between the RPP and other local targeted hiring programs. That could be things like if you qualify for one program, could you also qualify for some of the other programs? Could you have one agency that is the place to go if you're a worker and you're interested in getting certified for all of these different programs, or for employers, where employers can go and know this is where I need to go to get individuals who are qualified, ready, and certified for the program that I need to follow through on. So those are our recommendations. That's kind of our research findings, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
So first of all, just to repeat the question, the first question was when we cited those unemployment figures, was that region, city, or central city? The second question was, do we know why there's such a disparity in terms of unemployment between Latinos and African Americans?
The data is for the city of Milwaukee. In terms of why the disparities exist between African Americans and Latinos, I don't really have the answer for that one. Right over here, Dave. So the question was, what would need to happen in terms of City Hall to get some of these recommendations enacted, and did we involve city leadership in terms of the formation of the recommendations and the development of the report? So we have several trustees from the Public Policy Forum in the room here today, and they know that we are very diligent about working with officials from governments when we are analyzing programs within those governments. So we have briefed in detail the mayor, Council President Hamilton, Alderman
Alderman Russell Stamper, who's head of a new workforce organization reform committee that the city actually formed on its own to look at its own program as well. And I would say we will actually know a lot more later this week. On Thursday, this work committee is meeting to potentially go over some tangible recommendations. All indications are that the City Hall leadership is in agreement with the gist of the proposals that we have put forward. And again, the devil is going to be in the details. Just a couple of additional points on this. Number one, we are by no way, shape, or form suggesting that this is a failed program. In fact, this is a program that's working pretty well in terms of meeting its basic goals. The point we're making is there's an opportunity to go beyond just basic goals and to go into more targeted goals. And so that's where we think the potential is to go that next step. And that's where we think there is going to be some action. Mr. Frankie back there.
I haven't heard locally a lot of pushback on the 1,000 hours. There has been debate about the 30-day of unemployment. There's different opinions even on that. Some people wanted to shorten it to 15 days. Others thought that having even a 30-day unemployment qualification, you could be that could happen just by nature in the construction industry, that you have a period of unemployment. So it might be opening it up too much for too broad of a population. In terms of looking across the country, I didn't see a lot of examples with that underemployment kind of qualification. A lot of programs just have a standalone city residency requirement, and then they have separate goals that are targeting disadvantaged populations. So that's how we're different in that way. We pool them together into one qualification. In other places, there's a standalone. If you're a city resident, you qualify, and that's one goal. Separate from that, we're wanting to target disadvantaged populations who, for example, live in targeted zip codes with very high unemployment or, again, minority participation.
I would just add, I think you do touch on one of the major tensions, and there are several. And I think our point is not to sort of make a value judgment as to whether we ought to be focusing this program solely on those who are indeed unemployed versus wanting to ensure that people who are getting that first step into the construction industry continue to have job opportunities. What we're saying is that the policy objectives ought to be clear, and the program ought to be designed, and the goals ought to be designed based on what those specific policy objectives are. Tom.
Certainly, there are great obvious.
So the question was about the cost. Is there a cost added in terms of having this requirement where city residents need to be working a certain percentage of the hours on these projects? And, clearly, I don't think that anybody disputes that depending on how you establish your goals, there may indeed be some additional costs for contractors. We've talked to a lot of contractors. We had a meeting very early on with the key contractors on the NML project. How big is that cost in relationship to the profit and in relationship to the overall size of the project? That depends on the project. So an entity like NML clearly has the resources to be able to creatively establish the program, such as the one I mentioned, that is going to be able to essentially just pull people right off the street and do work on the project, which they're obviously not going to be able to do in terms of constructing the actual tower. It's those smaller projects where the contractors may not have that wherewithal, where it's a challenge. And again, that's where we think the notion of having a labor, management, government, overriding advisory council to work through these issues would really make a lot of sense. Should probably go over here. So the question was about, do we know what the benefit has been? Is anybody measuring outcomes to see what's happening to people who are participating in this program? And I think the answer to that question is no, and that was one of our concerns going in that we are also raising, is that we're not sure. But again, it depends on the policy objective. So if the policy objective is we just want to make sure that city residents are on these jobs, and we're not as concerned about whether these are career-changing jobs or career-establishing jobs, I guess there's not as much of a need to measure. We think coming out of these recommendations, there will be sort of a clearer definition of what we're after here, and there'll be more effort to do some quantifiable research into determining the long-term impacts. I mean, I think generally speaking, when we look at the construction industry, construction is not for everyone. And so, you know, we are by no means suggesting that this is an easy thing to accomplish. There have been so many efforts over the past 20 years to do what this program is trying to do. Essentially, again, take people who are disadvantaged, are unemployed, who don't necessarily have high skill levels, and make them into construction workers. And that's not going to work for everybody. So we wouldn't dispute the fact that we can't just feel like by setting goals we're going to have a successful program that's going to turn people's lives around. There's a lot of work that has to be done on the back end, and that indeed is one of the things that we're suggesting here. So the question was about what are the labor's union's view of this program, and is there a concern that by having a program like this, we're essentially going to be giving a benefit to new workers and displacing existing union workers from jobs? In terms of the response to that, it's an issue, and I think the really good news is that we are at a point in time in our history, and when you look forward, you don't see this surge in development relaxing anytime soon, where there is a demand for workers. I don't think there's any question that if we were in a down economy, if there wasn't so much construction work going on in this city, that we would not be having this conversation. The fact is, this is an opportunity. You combine that with the aging workforce, and there is a demand for construction workers. So then the question becomes, what are we going to do to ensure that these different building trades unions and these jobs are open to parts of our population that have traditionally not been included in this type of work? I think it's an easier time to deal with that question today, but the issue you raise is a question going forward, and if 6-7 years out, suddenly all these projects are finished and now we have a glut of construction workers and not enough work, it's going to become a dicier issue. Again, I point to this overriding advisory council to be able to work these things through and to be able to calibrate the goals, because that's the other thing we saw in these other cities. 40% may make perfect sense in today's economy. For all I know, 50% might make more sense in today's economy. But as economic conditions change, there may be a need to look at the goals and make them more realistic and to be able to guard against displacing existing workers. Dr. Driver.
Hi, Rob.
Hello.
My question is...
So the question was, we have Employ Milwaukee, again, that was formerly the Milwaukee Area Workforce Investment Board. They just changed their name. They have a whole host of strategic initiatives and plans to put people to work. And so how is this program being integrated with that work? Do you want to go for that, Joe?
I mean, I think, I don't know that there's integration right now, and I think that the way it's worked in other places is those councils have really just been focused on the program itself. So it is a separate thing. I can see your point, though, that you already have a council that is public-private and is focused on construction, but this is just really focused on those projects that qualify for RPP. So it's a really narrower focus. So I see your point, but I think having it be a separate thing still could be the way to go.
And I would just add, we have met with Earl Buford during the course of this project, and I believe that the recommendations that we're going to be seeing coming out of City Hall, the mayor obviously was put in charge of Employ Milwaukee a few years ago. The mayor's office works very closely with that entity, so I do expect to see that addressed in the recommendations that hopefully we'll see as soon as this Thursday. So the question was, to what extent do we know whether those participating in this program are receiving welfare benefits, and what happens to those benefits assuming they find work? We cannot answer that question to you specifically. Traditional aid for families with dependent children primarily encompasses women, so in terms of the male population, that would likely not be a factor. But then again, there's the food share program where it depends on income level. Ostensibly, once you find work, once that's sustained work, once you rise above a certain income level, then you're no longer eligible for those types of public benefits. Question was about the percentage of women on these projects.
We found it was only around 2%. I think it's pretty comparable to the general construction industry. In Minneapolis, their goal is 6%, so it's not very high numbers, but significantly higher, I guess, than 2%.
Dave.
Define hours worked for purposes.
Question was, how are the hours worked defined in terms of the goal?
It's all the hours completed on the project. I'm not-
Would that include supervisors as well as construction workers?
Yes, it includes.
Engineers, would it include architects?
It includes all levels of construction. I don't know, I can't give you the specifics on every single job that's included, but it is broader than just laborers. It's also supervisors as well.
We may have time for one more question, if there is one. If not, we'll turn things over to President Dan. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Joe, for an interesting presentation on one of the challenges facing the city now.
An MCM production.